Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 26, the East Lansing edition. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen, and I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group. Today we have a very interesting episode for you. We talk about World Bank Debarments, the Spanish pharmaceutical company Grifols lands its second DOJ FCPA declination. We take a deep dive into the resignation of Wells Fargo CEO John Stumpf and the botched crisis management as it was reported in the Wall Street Journal. We take a look at the first FCPA Mock Trial Institute. I talk about the mock trial portion of it, run by Joel Androphy, and then the second day, which will be the Institute portion, which is really headed up by Keith Hennessy. And we have 6 panels. We go into a bit of a discussion on what we're going to take a look at from this most interesting and unique first FCPA Mock Trial Institute. We talk about Mike Scher and myself's presentation at the FCPA Blog New York City Conference, where we're going to take a look at the question of who does the Chief Compliance Officer of a company report to, and how it should be thought of, or who should be thought of as his constituents. Jay gives us a preview of his upcoming weekend report, and he ends by congratulating the San Diego Chargers for beating the Denver Broncos and thereby sealing home field advantage for his beloved New England Patriots, Denver having had 2 consecutive losses. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA.
Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group, along with my colleague, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen, and we'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 26, the East Lansing edition, for the week ending October 14th, 2016. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you, Tom. We've got a lot to discuss, and looking forward to taking a look at the week that was. What should we go with first?
So I am in East Lansing, Michigan today, here for homecoming weekend at Michigan State, where we were playing the Fighting Northwestern Wildcats on Saturday. It was a brisk 37 this morning, so we were up and at it and early and ready to go. So with that, we had a couple of interesting reports, I thought, on the FCPA blog this week. The first one was from the World Bank, which indicated in the past year that they had debarred 58 entities. Don't really talk too much about the World Bank, but obviously as one of the world's leading aggregates of lenders, they have a very robust anti-corruption program. Our good friend Matt Ellis used to work as an investigator at the World Bank in the anti-corruption space, and so it was interesting when they released the information, and that's certainly well worth a read. I'll link to it in the show notes. The second thing on the FCPA front, more specifically, Jay, is the Spanish pharmaceutical company Grifols received its second FCPA declination from the Department of Justice. And I'm not really aware of any companies that are twofers in terms of declinations, although they're not always made public, so we might not be aware of them. Nevertheless, kudos to Grifols. It turned around its acquisition of another pharmaceutical company, Telecris, and actions which were carried out by Telecris when it was part of the Bayer Group. The internal investigation looked at sales by Telecris in Belarus, Russia, Iran, Brazil, Bulgaria, China, Georgia, Libya, Poland, Turkey, and the Ukraine. So very good kudos for Grifols, if that's how you pronounce it, that they received their second declination. So the big news for me this week, Jay, continues to be Wells Fargo. And we had a fairly stunning announcement of the immediate resignation with immediate effect of CEO John Stumpf, which is very unusual for any scandal to have the CEO remove himself so quickly. Usually we don't get that sort of action by the CEO. This apparently was not at the insistence of the board of directors, but the CEO suggested it, and the board accepted his resignation. So the first real CEO casualty we've seen in a long time. But what really intrigued me and what I wanted to visit about somewhat today, Jay, is just a scathing article in today's Wall Street Journal, which looked at the botched crisis management of Wells Fargo and how it really the case will continue to be just a teachable moment, lessons learned, case study, and how not to respond to a true crisis. And the thing that really struck me that I wanted to ruminate upon is a paragraph where they talked about the preparation that CEO John Stumpf engaged in prior to his Senate Banking Committee hearing. And for that preparation, they retained the law firm of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher and a partner named Michael Bopp. And he prepped the CEO. And quoting from the journal, the work focused on making sure Stumpf wouldn't get rattled by lawmakers and inflame the situation any more than it is, said a person familiar with the discussions. The person said Mr. Stumpf and the lawyers felt limited in what the CEO could say given the continuing investigations. Outside communication strategists weren't included in all the sessions. And really, it's not my intent here to criticize the law firm or their preparations, but to really show the difference in focus, Jay, of legal and lawyers and law firms from compliance, because that's what lawyers do. They protect the client. And sometimes that means circling the wagons. Sometimes that means going to the bunker. Sometimes that means going deep, deep, deep into the bunker underground and just waiting it out while the shelling continues. And anyone who has looked at either the Senate or House testimony has pretty much seen the disaster it was for John Stumpf personally and for Wells Fargo. They really didn't answer any of the questions the senators posed, and the article goes on to detail that in the pre-hearing meetings with other Wells Fargo executives, they really didn't have very good answers for the Senate or House staffers. And I think it really, like I said, points to the difference between compliance, because compliance would be there to not only prevent and detect, but also remediate. So how do we fix this? And those were not questions that Stumpf was prepared to answer or did answer at the hearing, and that certainly frustrated the regulators in the form of our senators and congressmen in the House. So a really good, very salient point, I think, for the difference in legal and compliance. Also, it points up that crisis management really means that. It means managing the crisis. And at this point, I really don't see any need for Wells Fargo to go into the bunker. And even more so, Wells Fargo needs to move in the other direction, to be more transparent and certainly more open to how they got to the place they were at. It was fairly stunning in the article. It also pointed out that of course, we've heard the number 5,300 Wells Fargo's employees fired for engaging in conduct which led to the scandal, but the board didn't find out about that number, Jay, until it was publicly released. So, I don't know where the board was on this, whether they certainly were not doing their job, and whether that was because the information was not revealed to them or hidden from them, whether they weren't looking, whether they weren't consciously indifferent, or whether this just was not material enough for the board to consider. In the light of day now, it certainly appears that information was not presented timely. So pretty interesting article about the crisis management part.
Well, I would throw a couple points into this, Tom. First of all, if we look back earlier into the year and what happened with the Volkswagen emissions matter, it seems to sometimes these events unfold too quickly, and I know it's a little bit ironic to say too quickly because these events have been happening years in the past, but sometimes it's almost like that train gets away and they're not prepared to deal with it. And I think the CEO at Volkswagen stepped down rather quickly too. And initially, to your point about the lawyers coming in and only saying what they think they legally need to say, I think part of this also goes back to when we take a look at the declinations or any type of DPA or NPA. We both know that there was a lot of negotiation that goes back and forth between the government and between what the company wants to admit to. So it may have been a miscalculation to go in there and to really talk about what was legally permissible, and I don't think that they really understood how this matter would just really inflame the public. So I think they're good points all along to consider, but I don't think that they understood the ire that the Senate and the House was going to have when Mr. Stumpf got at that table, and it was kind of like Revis Island instead, but it was Stumpf Island, and he was there all by himself.
Well, that's where this article really led a direction, Jay, that I might have to disagree with you on that, because it was pretty clear from the questions that the Senate staffers put to Wells Fargo employees. They wanted some specific information. They wanted information about where, for instance, one of the questions was, where did the number 5,300, how was that number derived? How did you come up with that? And the answer to the staffers initially was, well, we're contractually obligated or prevented from telling you that. Now, they eventually did get back to them with that number. It was PwC came up with that number. But when they were asked, how did you develop, what was the underlying financial calculus to develop the policy to have 8 products sold per customer, they couldn't answer that question. So I think there were some pretty specific questions, and it was pretty clear from the tenor of the article that the investigators were very frustrated at the lack of answers forthcoming from Wells Fargo. And indeed, one of the senators quoted said that he really went to the hearing with an open mind, but with CEO Stumpf not really stonewalling, but just not really answering or claiming he couldn't answer anything, even to the point where when clawbacks were brought up and executive compensation. So I think Wells knew what was coming, and for whatever reason, they chose not to be in a position or make responses. So maybe that's yet another lesson.
Can you think of anybody in recent history that really showed well or was able to use this? It's generally not a good thing to get called in front of Congress. So can you help us remember anything in the near past that somebody really was able to use this to their benefit or to at least change public opinion?
Well, actually, I was thinking back to General Motors, and when the GM CEO spoke, and she was, I think, pretty harshly treated, or at least for the purposes of congressional theater, was pretty harshly treated. But she came with specific answers, and she came with an apology. I think she was criticized for not terminating the general counsel, who later resigned or retired. But she also came with a program to compensate those who had sustained losses, and with a tangible program in place. So I don't pretend to suggest any of these are pleasant experiences for the people who have to go through them, but I think there's a way that you can be a little better prepared, or at least understand the fury you have unleashed, or your company has unleashed. And apparently Wells Fargo just had no idea of not the materiality of this, but the basic trust that they had broken with their customers, with the American people, and even our government in the form of our senators and representatives.
So maybe another way to look at it, quite often we're talking about you only get one chance to make a first impression, whether it's in front of the DOJ or the SEC. So in hindsight here, the team could have thought more about how fast this situation was changing. And to your point earlier, if they were more transparent and they had the questions, but they didn't have the answers. So things may have turned out in a different way if they were more willing to meet the truth head on as opposed to stonewalling.
Right. And come prepared with some answers to some really pretty basic questions. So continuing our discussion on that, I think will be many more episodes going forward.
Yeah, and then the other thing to watch too is I believe the person that they brought back to step off the bench and become a CEO is still somebody who's part of that senior management team. And to your point about watching this go forward, I would think there's got to be a very thorough house cleaning there of the people who are involved. And I don't know how you install confidence unless you bring in somebody from the outside and somebody who's got a real defined record of coming in and cleaning up a toxic situation like this. Right,
and promoting from within, I think, is going to be a challenge for whoever, and we know the person has been named, but moving forward is going to be a big part of their role. I think will be reestablishing the trust that has been destroyed by the actions of Wells Fargo to date.
So let's jump into something a little bit more positive and definitely unique. And earlier this week, you had a blog post that talked about a brilliant yet simple idea, and I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners about the first ever FCPA Mock Trial Institute that will be held in Houston.
Yes, I have to credit former Halliburton colleague Keith Hennessy and Houston criminal defense attorney Joel Anderfee for coming up with just the absolutely simplest yet one of those brilliant ideas I've heard in the FCPA space, which is to have a mock trial. And there may have been other FCPA mock trials, but this one adds a second component that really makes it unique, which is the institute portion. So they have put together a hypothetical fact scenario. Keith wrote it, and they have brought in some of the top professionals to actually try this case. So Joel is going to defend this case, and for those of you who might remember his name, Joel actually defended John O'Shea successfully in an FCPA case in Houston, Texas, along with his partner Sarah Frazier. So we have two lawyers in the mock trial who actually defended an FCPA case. They've got former DOJ heavyweight Will Stelmach from Wilkie Farr coming in to prosecute. He was formerly the acting chief and acting principal deputy chief of the fraud section of the FCPA, of the Department of Justice. And they have a former DOJer, AUSA, former district court judge, and now Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals judge, Greg Costa, to preside over it. So we have a real heavy hitter list of those in the mock trial portion of the event, and that will be day one. And then day two, we're going to sort of unpack it, dissect it, and go into it in a lot of different angles. So for instance, of course, Joel and Bill will dissect it from the and Michael Clark, who will also participate, another Houston attorney, from the trial lawyer's perspective of talking about the evidence, the witnesses, and how that went. I'm going to lead a panel on current and former chief compliance officers, and we're going to discuss what went wrong in the organization. We're going to have corporate heads of litigation talk about government cooperation, the Yates memo, internal investigations. There's going to be a panel to look at this from the corporate secretary perspective, that's not somebody we often talk about in the FCPA world, Jay, but if you've been in a corporation, the corporate secretary, he's really the gatekeeper in terms of information to the board. So he would provide information to the board, put together a board book for each board meeting, keep the board minutes, and if not an active participant, certainly would be the recorder or reporter. So they're in the discussions, and in that panel, we're going to talk, or they are going to discuss the decision to self-disclose, the decision to make what information available to the public and when, because if you're a public company, obviously you have certain mandatory public disclosures. And then I'm going to lead a panel on a twofold topic. One is the ethics for the lawyers involved in this, but then we're going to have several very prominent journalists and former journalists talk about how they might cover this case. So, for instance, Lauren Steffi is a former business columnist for the Houston Chronicle, and he covered the Enron case. So, very interesting perspective. Lauren's going to be on the panel. Chris Tomlinson, the current business columnist from the Houston Chronicle, will also be on the panel. So, Walt Pavlo will be on the panel. And so we're going to have some really interesting discussions of the journalistic and journalism perspective that we don't normally get. So this is just going to be a fabulous event. We're going to link to registration and information in the show notes. I hope you will consider attending, even if certainly if you're in Houston, but even if you're not. And I'm really looking forward to this, and going to learn a lot of new and interesting ways to look at FCPA cases.
Question, Tom. When we were last together in Chicago and we did our little podcast extravaganza, is there any thought to virtually making this available either in real time or after the fact for folks who won't be able to make it into Houston?
I don't know what the American Bar Association has in terms or in plans if they will make that available or not. The ABA is running it, and I don't know what their plans are along those lines.
Yeah, because I really think, to your point earlier, that this is the first time anybody's really kind of taken a deep dive, and I think it's fascinating that we have the Fourth Estate, and we have all the other constituencies represented here. So it's really going to be interesting to dissect this from these different points of view and see where everything falls out in the end.
Right.
So that's one. What were the dates on that again, Tom?
November 16 and 17 in Houston.
Okay, so people have about a month to figure that out. What's coming up in the more near future is a week and a half away. We're getting ready for the inaugural FCPA Blog Conference in New York City. And earlier this week, you had a very interesting podcast with Mike Scher and yourself. Do you want to give a little bit of a clue, not a clue, but a little bit of a preview as to what you're going to speak about?
Sure. So Mike and I are on a panel with Julie DeMauro, and our designated topic is the Chief Compliance Officer. Who does he work for? Does he work for the shareholders? Does he work for the CEO? Does he work for the corporation? Does he work for the Department of Justice? Who are the constituents that the CCO works for? And we really are going to tie it to something, Jay, straight out of Walmart. The Walmart Code of Ethics and Business Conduct, which of course applies to all employees as well as officers and directors, provides a logic tree for making the right choice. And the logic tree reads, is it legal? Question. Next question, does it comply with our policies? Question. Next question, is it consistent with our values? Question. The next question, is it consistent with our long-term goals and interests? And then finally, would I be comfortable with my decision if it's made public? And Jay, that seemed to me to be a very interesting way to introduce the constituencies that a chief compliance officer must deal with, because it's got the first question, is it legal? Can we do it? That leaves aside the question of should we do it? But the second question is, Does it comply with our internal law, our internal corporate policies? Because every corporation has their own policies, procedures, internal rules and regulations, which are their corporate law. So does it comply with our own law? Next, we move to the values question. We can do it, but should we do it? So there, we're going to take a look at the Chief Compliance Officer maybe looking at things a little bit differently, certainly than the legal department would, and even the internal corporate regulations, because if not an ethical focus, certainly a cultural focus, and that's something that's very relevant after Wells Fargo. The next question looks to, is it consistent with our long-term goals and interests? And I particularly enjoy this one because this to me speaks to capitalism at its finest. Is it consistent with our long-term profitability? Long-term goals, profitability, and interests. Well, if we think back to Wells Fargo and the report that all of this conduct, which we're still talking about, generated $400,000 in almost 6 years, I would suggest that that might not be consistent with long-term profitability of Wells Fargo. It's such a minuscule amount for a $240 billion corporation. So the CCO certainly needs to consider profitability and the business aspect, because after all, once again, we're capitalists at heart. So is the action consistent with long-term profitability and interest? And then finally, the public sphere. What would happen if your decision is on the front page of the New York Times, of the Wall Street Journal, of AOL Online, of the Financial Times, of Slate Magazine, wherever it may be? Would you be comfortable with that decision being sliced, diced, dissected, scrutinized, and then cooked and served up to the Senate or House Banking Committee? So I found this logic tree for making the right choice a great way to think about who does the CEO, who are the CCO's constituents, who should the CCO be representing, thinking about, talking about, and we're going to use this really as a way to explore that question, and that's something that we talked about in the podcast. Once again, I'll link to that in the show notes, and then also Mike tells me he's going to have some questions he's held back and going to surprise me with at the FCPA Blog New York Conference. So it'll be interesting to see what he's got. All of that leading to the FCPA Blog Conference on Wednesday, October 26th in New York City. If you are in New York or want to attend, I hope you will go to it. The registration information is linked in the show notes. Listeners to this podcast get a 20% discount. So be sure and utilize that. And I'm really looking forward to it, Jay.
So let me just jump back to that template that you've used. There seems to be a certain hierarchy involved, and the first one is, is it legal? Is it purposefully written that way, or do you and Mike intend to take a look at those different constituencies, and should it maybe be ordered in a different manner?
Well, that's one of the things we're going to explore. So it's really going to be free form, and we may end up with more questions at the end of the day than answers, but there'll be questions that would lend themselves to further discussion.
All right, so we are in the early throes of football season. You are in East Lansing for a game, and I think we know who you're supporting there. What do you think about any thoughts so far into Week 5 of the NFL season?
Well, I find it particularly interesting that you are so obsessed with the NFL, not only in Week 5, but you were in Week 4 when you tweeted out, thank you, Matty Ice, for a win in Denver. Only bookended with your Thursday night Facebook posting. Thank you, Phillip Rivers, as the New England Patriots clinch home field advantage here in the 5th week.
I guess I'm just an incorrigible scoreboard watcher, and since I can't watch any more scoreboards from my Red Sox, but it's good to see that you're going to have Dave Roberts, who scored home back in 2004 for the first Red Sox World Series since most of New England ever existed. And he's going up against Theo Epstein and some other former Red Sox. So I guess there are some people that I can root for in the World Series, but I'm firmly in the football season now. And, I think last night's game just really shows you that there's just such volatility and unpredictability in the NFL. And I don't think anybody gave San Diego a chance to win that game. And, at the end of the evening, it was only an 8-point differential. And, when that ball is high up in the air and you got to knock it down, the guy for the Chargers actually knocked it up. And if he was a little bit closer to the end zone, it could have been a much different ending.
Well, I watched the game last night, staying up well past my bedtime. And at one point, I think with 8 minutes left, San Diego was up 21-3. No one saw this coming. 21-3 at one point, and it really wasn't that close. Total domination by San Diego. So kudos to Phil Rivers, kudos to Mike McCoy, kudos to the San Diego Chargers for a game well played and an upset that I don't think anybody saw coming.
So what do we think? Could the ultimate champion of the AFC West be the Raiders?
Well, it certainly could be. I'm not sure they're going to get past the Broncos, but as everyone who follows or listens to you homers know, all you care about is home field advantage. So that would be a huge plus for the Patriots if they get that. And having the road to the Super Bowl go through New England will certainly make it a difficult door to smash through.
All right. Well, thank you for indulging my football needs. Is there any other business we have to before we wrap up today?
Well, we certainly would like a preview of the Jay Rosen weekend report.
Sure. Thank you. So one of the things that we're very excited about, although Tom always refers to me as Mr. Translations, for the past 6 years, I've worked for a company known as Merrill Brink International, and we're very excited right now that we are rebranding ourselves, and as of November 1st, we'll be known as the United Language Group. Same capabilities, sharper focus on translation, and our continued dedication to the FCPA ethics and compliance practitioners. And in honor of that impending change, I've put together a 6-part series about how a language solutions provider can be helpful in many of these foreign situations, or actually, let's not use foreign, but situations where there's non-English data, and whether that comes from an investigations perspective or an ethics and compliance. So in this weekend's read, I'm going to share something that I'm entitled 3 Ways That a Language Solutions Provider Can Prepare Your Company for Legal Investigations. So I hope the 6-part series will be of interest, and that's what I'm going to kick off with on this weekend's read.
Well, excellent, Jay. So are the say again? The Patriots playing again? Who do the Patriots play this weekend, I should say, or do they have an off week?
No, the Patriots play, they're on to Cincinnati. We've heard that before. Ooh. And I think last week Cincinnati was very, very easily handled by Dallas. So I think they're going to be hungry to show that they've got a little bit more left in the tank. So Brady comes home for the first time since his suspension. So it's a 1 o'clock game. It's an early game, but I think it's going to be one of the better ones this weekend.
All right. Well, good luck, and we look forward to visiting with you again next week, Jay.
All right. Tom, thanks so much. And everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us as we dissected the week in FCPA that was.